and very happy to see so many faces that are familiar and unfamiliar. These Rita Puga's faces are very unfamiliar to me. So welcome, and we're going to take off sort of immediately by talking, introducing our first speaker for this afternoon, Dr. Jeff Chang, who's an associate professor in the Graduate Center for Applied Psychology at Athabasca University in Canada. Jeff is a registered psychologist in the province of Alberta, Canada, and a clinical fellow and approved supervisor in the American Association for Marriage and Family Therapy. He has published quite widely, particularly about high conflict divorce, clinical supervision, child and family therapy, and school-based counseling. And he is still very active in working in the, with children and with families in the area where he is in Athabasca in Calgary. And therefore, I welcome you this afternoon, Jeff, to talk to us about building family supports for learning and helping us to see how we can move forward in our school-based family counseling. Over to you.
Thanks for that intro.
Sorry, just before you start, I just want to remind everybody, although you've all been here earlier in the week, when the speaker is in charge, please mute your speaker, and when you want to ask a question, just put up your hand signal, which is from the reactions at the bottom, and I will introduce you. And Jeff, I will warn you when there's 5 minutes left.
Okay, terrific. Thank you. Well, it's great to be here. I was just thinking about exactly ago today, we were in Oxford, and that was quite an experience for me. I met Hertina and Sheena and Brian there, and I think there's some other people on here that might have been there. But that was a great experience for me, and I really appreciate the work that Brian and others have been doing to advance the issue of children's mental health in the context of schools. So before I start, or as I, oops, let's see. There we go. So today I'm joining you from Burnaby, British Columbia. It's not where I live, but I'm out here on a trip, which is located on the ancestors of the Squamish and Musqueam people. And I normally live and work in Calgary, Alberta, Canada, which is the territory of the Treaty 7 First Nations. So those are the Stoney Nakoda people, the Blackfoot Nation and the Tsuut'ina Nation, and of the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. And I acknowledge my status as a settler on these lands, and also want to acknowledge the current historical and current egregious treatment of Indigenous peoples in Canada. It's been newsworthy lately here in Canada about finding many hundreds, if not thousands, remains of children and others who were taken from their families in the last century, and well, in early 20th century and in the 1800s, who were taken from their families by churches and the police to go to residential schools and have their culture wiped out. So I want to acknowledge that. Just how to get a hold of me, my website. The PowerPoint for this, oops, don't copy this, because this here is supposed to be a period, not a comma, drjeffchang.webs.com. And then go to speaking engagements, scroll to the bottom, and it's already up. So for once, I'm organized enough to have this up before the presentation, and there's my email. And
it's the symposium.
So just my overview for today, the story of Jason, multiple perspectives. I think you've all probably met Jason and his teachers and parents in some form or another. Talk a little bit about psychoeducational assessment, definition and practice, and another issue connected with that. relational patterns surrounding learning difficulties, and the role of school-based systemic counselors. Three things here. This is just sort of experience I picked up along the way. None of this is empirically validated. This is really a clinical presentation. So you're working as a child and family counselor in elementary school. And it's generally middle class, but there's a large apartment block that houses many low-income families. And Jason has been referred to you. So it's April, and you meet with the vice principal Mavis and Jason's teacher Connor. They tell you Jason is it's the end of grade 3, and he can't read. He seems more interested in other students across the classroom than his seat work or on Connor's lessons. He seems to be out of his seat a lot. And his handwriting, actually, he doesn't write in cursive. Here in Canada, generally you learn to write cursive in grade 3. Is slow and laborious. When he does manage to write something, he writes down letter reversals. And Connor, you think is a great teacher. And it's taken this long to get Jason to get a connection with him. Connor has gone out of his way to involve Jason in things, and calls upon Jason to help him. And Jason seems to really like Connor's attention a great deal. Mavis, the vice principal, tells you that things are a bit better now. Jason was aggressive in grades 1 and 2. And his teacher both years was Arlene, who has a structured, firm, and business-like teaching style. And as you talk more, again, in your role as a counselor, Mavis isn't sure about what's going on with Jason's parents. Jason's mother indicated that his dad and I are splitting up, but Jason talks about my dad living in the house, and is this a new partner or not? We don't really know. Oops, that's a repeat. Sorry about that. And then Connor says, well, Jason referred to his dad and his new sister. So what's going on here, right? Mavis says, well, I don't think there's a lot of structure over there. And you can't tell whether she's being concerned or she's being disdainful and negative. But then she said, I've made a referral to Dr. Tester, the psychologist. That should help us. So, there's lots of perspectives that people can take in these situations. I think we've all had referred to as kids like Jason. We know teachers like Arlene who are like kind of drill sergeants. We've seen teachers who are like Connor, who are like Mr. Enthusiasm. And, vice principals are often involved in these student issues, and they're very, very concerned, often very concerned about what's going on. So, that's kind of a situation that I think a lot of us has faced. I'd be surprised if those of us who are, in practice have not had a similar situation. So, whose perspective is valued here? So we can look at different people's ways of dealing with the situation. So, Mavis is, as vice principal, she's probably seen a lot. So what's going on with this family? Connor might be thinking, well, this kid needs somebody to connect with, and he's not really going to make any progress academically till he can do that. Arlene, Arlene wasn't in this meeting, but Arlene, and maybe Arlene's thinking, wow, this kid just needs to, needs some structure and firmness, and I won't take any crap from him. Laura, the mom, help, right? And she's got it sounds like she's got her hands full, because it sounds like she's got a new baby. And we don't know if there's other kids, but it sounds like she's got a lot. And we don't know the relationship status, right? Whether this is a new partner, whether it's going well with her current partner, whether we don't really know that, whether it was actually Jason's bio dad, who, things it seems were rocky with a couple of years ago. So we don't know the mom's perspective. And then, the psychologist might be already developing some hypotheses about, his handwriting, Jason's handwriting is very laborious. So what is that, right? Are those is that, um, uh, poor visual motor integration, where he can't write and reproduce what he sees on the blackboard? Is it poor visual spatial reasoning, where he can't comprehend what's on the page in front of him, or on the board in front of him? He gets out of his seat a lot. He's more interested in other kids. Does an ADHD diagnosis fit? Or is it maybe just generally low cognitive ability? Like, to put it kind of bluntly, he's just not that bright of a kid. Poor impulse control. And what other social emotional factors are interfering with learning? Okay, so there's a lot going on here. And and also, are the learning problems secondary to something else? You probably had experiences of children where it looked like they really had a learning problem, and there were some limitations to their learning capacity, and I've seen situations where once a child's in a different environment, they seem to be their learning abilities to improve significantly, because they're coming out of an impoverished environment. And then the big question is, how does this little boy experience things, right? I mean, us adults are talking all the time, and we kind of exclude the experience of this little guy. What's his world like? Does he just experience school as a totally frustrating experience? Does it just, on the Charlie Brown cartoons, all we see is that, whenever adults talk, the teachers are going, wah, 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 wah. Is that all this kid experiences? Does he really understand what's going on and what's happening at home? So then, as systemically trained counselors, how can we put all these threads together? I'm going to suggest that as school-based family counselors or systemic therapists, we are well equipped, maybe the best equipped people, to keep the big picture in mind. What are the patterns of interaction between the parents, the parental subsystem? We don't know who that is, really. It could be mom and stepdad, it could be mom and dad, it could be mom and dad with mom and stepdad with dad involved in a separate household. Is that conflictual? Is that going okay? Between the parents and Jason, patterns of interaction between teachers and Jason, patterns of interaction between the school and the parents, the influence of the larger system, psychoeducational assessment findings, and the meaning that people place on these findings. So do people just see this little boy, let's say, the findings come back in a particular way? Do they see this little boy as limited? Do sometimes parents don't believe what they're being told by a school psychologist? And teachers and parents' capacity to implement recommendations. And then, of course, how does Jason experience the world? Okay, so just a quick primer on psychoeducational assessment. This has been governmentally driven. In France, it was concerned with the placement of children over 100 years ago, and the US Army wanted to test and place properly World War I recruits. So there's been lots of abuses of cognitive assessment or psychoeducational assessment or intelligence testing, whatever we want to call it. And of course, in Canada now, we're very aware of issues with Indigenous people. But it's still a useful endeavor. We get a complex picture of the learner's abilities, and current models of human intelligence recognize that it's complex, really complex. But when a psychoeducational assessment is done, it's typically limited to family engagement or involvement. It's typically limited to school psychologists taking developmental history, which includes school and history of learning issues. Sorry for the typo there. Leaning issues, sorry. And information about the parents' discipline practices. Those are usually what's covered, but often there's not a family intervention is kind of on the back burner. And these days, of course, psychoeducational assessment still serves a governmental purpose, because in my jurisdiction in Alberta, at least, but probably many others, at least in North America, special education funding follows an assessment, but can lead to labeling. But to me, it's a bit problematic. The way in many jurisdictions, not a lot of funding for public education. More children, people need assessments than can be provided. And then often the model is a school psychologist parachutes in and tests and tells and then leaves, right? And so schools and parents are left with a basket full of recommendations. Sometimes I've seen recommendations, a section that's longer than the report itself, and with little guidance about how to deal with them. So I just want to give you a quick window into some of the thinking that I've done in terms of what are the patterns that, and I'll just briefly introduce you to the IPScope. My mentor, Dr. Carl Tom, was in the late 80s, working with children and youth. The funder wanted to require him to give a DSM diagnosis to every kid. And of course, diagnosis has a common language, but psychiatric diagnosis doesn't tell us a lot about causes. If you've got flu-like symptoms, right now it's really important to know whether you've got influenza or COVID. But psychiatric diagnosis, symptoms kind of drive the decision-making. It doesn't tell us a lot about causes. So those of us at Calgary Family Therapy Center developed the IPScope. So if you think about scope, you look through something and it changes things, the way you view it. It's simply a tool for us to get us thinking about our interactions with others. So IPS, interpersonal patterns, are coupled behaviors. So this is one that I hope you have in your lives with a loved one, sharing difficulties and listening attentively. That we would call that a WIP, a wellness interpersonal pattern. And here's a lot of sample WIPs that I hope you all have lots of in your life with your loved ones. But on the other hand, there's PIPs, pathologizing interpersonal patterns that create problems and invite participants into negative emotions and behavior. So a classic one is criticizing and defending. And here's a list of sample PIPs. They don't have to be different, right? It could be ignoring and ignoring. It's not volatile, it's just cold, right? And I also want to introduce you to healing interpersonal patterns, which are a subcategory of wellness interpersonal patterns. And they're kind of an antidote or replacement for a WIP, or for a PIP, sorry. And we see lots of these, again, sample PIPs. And to replace them, like the criticizing and defending, we might have people do something different. So here's just a series of imposing and resisting, that unruly child that you need to control, or somebody needs to control. requesting and cooperating. Could be a hip. Scrutinizing and evading. Watching somebody very closely to see they don't make a mistake. Supporting and accepting support. Could be a hip. And these aren't prescriptive, they're just descriptive. Pursuing and distancing, respectfully, engagedly, and responding willingly. So these are just some samples. But what I want to ask you now is, what pips and hips have you encountered between parents and their child, particularly if a child is experiencing learning problems? So maybe you want to just throw it up into the chat, or for that. And Hertina, are you going to do that? Are you going to take a look at if anybody's putting something into the chat? So what patterns, what have you seen in terms of problematic interactions that happen between parents and their child if a child is experiencing learning difficulties?
Anybody with something to add here? Put up your hand so that I can unmute you.
Or
I'm just thinking of something like the parent who is continuously talking in a very confrontational voice, shouting loud, and the
Perfect.
child continuing to almost like calling it out, asking for that. So the minute the parent softens their voice, the child does not react, because the child has grown up from early childhood that the parent only commands and shouts. So that is for me a problematic pips.
So shouting, withdrawing?
Yeah.
Great.
There's a shorty, they only respond when the parent is shouting, because they learned from a very young age that, so when the parent is not shouting, when you try to calm the parent down, the child is unsure. They don't know what to do.
Okay. Great. So that pip is well entrenched.
Yeah.
And then they don't know what to do otherwise. So then an attempt to change it might falter at the beginning.
Yeah.
Yeah. Great.
Anybody else? Yes. Okay, Brian.
When I was an adolescent, I once witnessed in a mall a parent upset with her child because the child wouldn't eat, and she was force feeding the child, and the child was choking, and I was I didn't know what to do with that because I was so young.
So imposing, and then something else, right? Like imposing, resisting.
Yeah.
That could happen just as easily with learning. Like, do your homework, right? And having a child sit for hours and hours trying to do their homework that maybe might not be configured for them properly, or might be too difficult for them.
Okay, we have a question. We have a contribution from Rita. Okay, Rita, just unmute yourself.
Yes. One I see most common are tantrums.
Right.
Throwing tantrums, and I specifically more in the groceries where I see them. Yep. When they're not getting, the candy or, toy of choice. Right. Yep. And they're throwing tantrums. I've seen parents where they ignore the behavior and they kind of walk away, but the child does end up staying there and until the parent comes back and hands them that toy.
Okay.
Or that. But then I've also seen situations where child throws tantrum, parent ignores, and child gets up and goes with parent.
Okay. That's a really important point, because it's not that these PIPs are right or wrong. It's based on how the actual pragmatic effect of them. So there's going to be times when tantruming, ignoring is a PIP, because it keeps on going and it creates more strife between them, right? There's going to be times when tantruming, ignoring is a HIP, because it works, right? The child calms down, the child, right? So so it's not that any of these, that list of examples I gave you is quote bad, right? It's a very important point that it is determined by the pragmatic effect. Does it work or does it not work? Does it create more closeness and more, warmer emotions, or does it create, or at least neutral, or does it create emotional negative emotions and conflict? Okay, so then what pips and hips have you encountered between a teacher and their student?
Okay, here's another question for everybody. Put up your hand if you have something.
Think about the example of Arlene in the vignette, right? What might Arlene have been doing to invite the little boy's problematic behavior?
You must just unmute yourself if you have a contribution. Brian?
This used to be one of my favorite examples to show in class, a video of a Chinese teacher teaching a university class. And a student in the front row was on his cell phone. And without stopping her lecture, she walked over, took the phone, threw it on the ground, stomped on it, and went back to her lecture.
Great, love it.
Now, I have an example from a teacher that uses various kind of ways to embarrass the student in front of his peers. That is something that, because when the teacher feels that they lose control because of the child's behavior, they can draw out all kinds of ways to embarrass that child. Now, with a young child like Jason, maybe it's a bit difficult, but particularly when it's around adolescents, to make crude remarks about the child's appearances or something like that.
Yeah. Last night I had, one of these loud family dinners where you get together with your siblings once every few years, and cousins. We're talking about how teachers back in our day, right? We're all in our 60s and 70s. Used to use corporal punishment quite literally, right? But these days, I mean, it just might be, yelling, resisting, or it might be, sending kids to the office and increasing resentment. And again, we don't know what's going on for these kids, right? It could be that there's, learning disability going on, or it could be undiagnosed ADHD. We don't know. So that's often why we need a psychoeducational assessment. Okay. And any good examples of the interactions, the problematic interactions that occur between school staff and parents?
And Kathleen, you had your hand up?
Oh, sorry, did I move on too quickly?
No, that's fine.
No, it's okay. I was just going to raise the issue of my very favorite current book is Oprah Winfrey and Bruce Perry's book, What Happened to You?
Oh, yeah.
The idea, the school traditional focus on what's wrong with you, which is what special education is based on.
Imagine.
Yeah,
right now. I know, but I want to make sure, because Brian said, I have it on.
Somebody needs to mute, please.
Yeah. I think what's wrong with you is a tip, and I'm just wondering about what other things we could do instead.
Great, thank you.
Sorry, that's just an interruption. Yeah.
And then,
okay.
Have you ever seen a tussle between school staff and parents where, they're just not on the same page about how to discipline the child, or how to, what supports the child needs with learning? Right? I mean, that happens a lot, right? And sometimes it's a slow burn. It's a sort of a tense armed truce, but sometimes, you may have seen school meetings where it gets kind of volatile, or, the parent-teacher interviews go south because they just don't agree about that. Okay, and sometimes there's disagreements among school staff. One of the people that we're supervising for licensure um, has been working in a school, and she's dealing with a teacher right now who's just very negative, but also very self-conscious about how she's appearing to the child and to the parents. And she's just kind of quite stricken that she thinks the child and the parents don't like her, right? And that's
Jeff,
driving
just
her.
about 5 minutes, please.
Okay, great. Okay. So, and hips and pips between parents. What's our role? Parent support and liaison. So hopefully as school-based systemic counselors, we can develop a relationship with parents that maybe, and if we know that parents, perhaps we know from the school administration that parents are having a tough time, we can develop a non-demanding relationship with parents that predates the assessment. The thing that's important is that it has to be something where we're not demanding something, right? Similar to how we work with children, we need to be different than other professionals. We need to be somebody who doesn't tell kids what to do. In a world with teachers and parents, when people are telling them what to do, sometimes effectively, sometimes not so effectively. But if we can just be, come alongside parents, that's really important. And in the case of Jason, we could imagine that a school-based counselor working with the family would already have contact with the parents, and the counselor can help the school develop an approach strategy to get consent for the assessment, explaining the process and the benefits of a psychoeducational assessment, supporting the implementation of recommendations, and liaison with the school psychologist. It's really important that as a counselor who's based in a school, we need to understand the stuff that happens in a psychoeducational assessment. We need to understand the statistical meanings of the scores, what the various scales mean, and put ourselves in the child's skin in terms of imagining what it would be like to be trying to learn with that particular set of abilities. It's very important. Not that most counselors are going to be administering psychoeducational assessment instruments, but it's important that we understand the meaning of them. So school-based systemic counselors can also be a systemic coach. So we're noticing PIPs and nurturing potential HIPs in the various subsystems. So between parents, between the parents and the school, between teachers and the student, noticing and potentially supporting different behaviors. So we can provide indirect suggestions. Sometimes teachers will come to you and say, I don't know how to handle this kid. Can you give me some ideas? And you might have some helpful ideas for behavior management. Or we might have some side door suggestions, I call them, to interrupt PIP. So sometimes simply, and I've been influenced a great deal by solution-focused ideas. So sometimes simply asking somebody to pay attention to when it's better. Because people are naturally default to looking for problems. But just asking people, asking a teacher or a parent to pay attention to when things aren't so good, or pay attention to when aren't so bad, I should say, or pay attention to what somebody might be doing that helps the situation. That might be themselves, the teacher or parent themselves, or it might be get them to notice what the child is doing that makes a difference. And then being a system coordinator, right? We're the ones as systemic thinkers that have a big view of the situation, and we can notice and coordinate the the school's response. The other main focus is to be a child facilitator. This might not be doing ongoing therapy, but it might. But it's just important that we be the person that the child gets to know the child and who's not telling the child what to do. And potentially support the child in addition to maybe some other work we're doing to implement learning strategies where possible. So School-based systemic counselors have a unique role in schools. Typically, we're the only ones who have the training to maintain the big picture view and make systemic sense of things. And, I want to just mention that, it's not, my ideas are not normative. This is not the right way to do things. It's just I've just kind of crystallized these ideas for this presentation, ideas that I've been using over the years that seem to help in helping engage parents in this process. Hopefully it's helpful, and I'm happy to answer some questions now.
Thank you very much, Jeff. That was quite interesting. And I think as we have Zippy here, who was on Friday, who talked about the emotion-focused group therapy with the parents, which actually these two things come for me so close together, as though you two need to talk a lot more. Now, we are running a little bit over time because of the excitement of this presentation. I do want to say—
That's very kind.
Two, maximum 3 questions, if you make sure your question is no longer than half a minute, so that Jeff can have half a minute to answer. Okay, the first hand I see is Brian.
I want to congratulate you, Jeff, on the use of the concepts of PIPs, WIPs, and HIPs, which is a language that you can use very easily with parents and with families. And I'm thinking myself, my wife is coming home today from a 5-week trip to Canada. And if I don't have this house clean, I'm going to get a whip and I'm going to need a hip.
No, having the house clean will encourage a whip. You'll be caring for her and she'll be feeling cared for.
That's it. Okay, Mike, you are on.
Hi, Jeff, it's great to hear you. I just want to thank you for your presentation and just say, along with Zibby, you're definitely somebody I want to be connecting to around this phenomenon of how the different pieces of the system interact in dysfunctional and functional ways. That was really helpful to have that crystallized. I've been teaching that in lots of different ways, and I'm a solution-focused guy as well. So I'm excited to talk to you more. So thank you.
Excellent.
Yes.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Mike. Anybody else who has a question, unmute yourself. Jackie.
Thank you. Jeff, I just really enjoyed the peaceful and the calm that you have, knowing we work with children, as I do as well. The demeanor that a personal therapist has in a family work is the key. And you had mentioned Tom as the mentor that you had. And I have been using Tom and Wright's paper of executive skills for the last 7 years for the NYU psychiatric residents.
Cool. And
they said out of all the papers they read about family therapy, that was the best one they can understand. The other thing is that he must be very proud of you as his mentee. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jackie. Okay, one more, and then we're going to ask Edwin to do the thank you. Okay, Peter, unmute yourself.
There. Jeff, hello. And after emailing with you for many years, at last we're actually talking. I just have a postscript, which is I'm really curious about Jason. What happened in the end?
Well, there's lots of Jasons. That was just kind of a composite.
What do you think happens to Jason, to composite Jason?
Well, my hope is that if everything goes well, the psychoeducational assessment is really helpful and gives a clear conceptualization of what this little guy's learning is about. And then my other fantasy is that there would be a school-based counselor who can navigate these systems and can support people to implement recommendations instead of just leaving the psychoeducational assessment finishing with a 10-page recommendations section and nobody to support the teacher and the parents to do it. So that's my fantasy. And then his behavior will calm down, then his parents will have a better handle on him. Then his teachers will have a better handle on how to connect with them. And the school-based family counselor can kind of be a system coordinator and can kind of be a traffic cop.
Thank you. Follow the threads and get to the bottom of it.
Yeah.
Okay. One more, and Norita, do you have a question? Okay. So I think as we're running into the last 5 minutes, but now Edlin has just moved away. So I do have a question is if you, how you would, for example, integrate these WIPs and BIPs, the IP score, with working also with the parents, because oftentimes the parents, the family system has a lot of these dysfunctional behaviors, how the parents react, and children are incredible imitators.
Yeah.
So do you have a way of involving or engaging with the parents in a separate way as a systems counselor?
Yeah, a couple of things. One is that I think when people are able to see things in terms of circular patterns, then they're much less blameful of one another, right? So many times, it's like, we'll be seeing a family at the center or, in my practice for therapy. And the common thing is, I don't know how I can get this kid to do something. I've tried everything. So the parent's saying something like that, I've tried everything, nothing works. And you find out what they've been doing, and then sometimes even drawing it on the whiteboard for them. It's like, so criticizing. So what happens when that, what does that engender? So seeing that as a pattern and not just, a problematic behavior in the child or a problematic, or the child saying, well, like, Dad, why are you so mad all the time? Why can't you just stop yelling at me, right? So instead of seeing them as individual behaviors, seeing them as coupled behaviors, is very helpful in therapy. People feel less blamed when they see it as a pattern. The other thing is that this is great for I've presented on this with with teachers to think about their classroom management this way, in work situations with workplace groups, to think about their interactions with colleagues and subordinates. Yeah. So.
Okay, let's see if we can get this person to mute. Alex, please mute yourself. Okay, thank you very much, Jeff.
Yeah.
I see, yes, let's give him a clap. And Edlin was on and then she went off, and I wanted to ask her to do the appreciating and the thank you.
Edlin's on the spot.
I will now have to do it myself. I'm the impromptu moderator this evening, and since I know you, want to thank you very much. One of the things that I appreciate about your presentation is that although we acknowledge the psychoeducation assessments and all the diagnostic criteria, that we need to look more at the big picture. And I think that is one thing that I know from school-based family counseling, that we put on different lenses and we're trying to see the system as a whole. And it's often not just within the micro and the exosystem, but even in the macro system, where the government requires us to put down a diagnosis, but they don't provide us with enough psychoeducation, psychoassessments.
Exactly.
So the child is actually, and the family is struggling, and the teacher is struggling for months on end because there's not enough. Only the government can appoint do the psychoassessment. I had that in Macau, for example, where the government had one assessor or somebody who could do the testing, but they were so fully booked that this child with a serious learning disability couldn't get any help for 18 months. That makes it impossible. In the end, how do you help that child? And then he goes through these first year and a half of school life and he cannot survive. So that's what I appreciate. So although we acknowledge this, is that sometimes we have to also look at this whole system outside of that required diagnostic label that would give us the funding and help the parents and the teachers to help the child. So I thank you very much. It was for me very interesting, apart from the fact it's very good to see you again after so many years.